So I had about 8 different speaking events in Southeast Missouri last year, and this one really was my favorite. You're just such a kind and supportive group, so I'm really happy to be back. So, I don't know if you're aware, but yesterday, Punxsutawney Phil said we're going to have an early spring, and I'm really excited about that. So I'm already thinking about gardening because I'm an avid gardener. But I want to kind of feel this group out. So how many of you have a green thumb? Okay, half a green thumb. So the rest of you can't grow plants to save your life? Is that pretty much?
I can some, and
okay.
It's not like I'm covered in plants. But
okay. Well, my entire presentation is about things that I've learned from gardening, but I made sure that even if you can't grow a thing, you will gain something from it. I promise, okay? And I don't have a money back guarantee, but you don't have to invite me back if you don't learn anything today, okay? So, as you're probably aware, the Bible is absolutely packed with stories about plants and nature. And life began in a garden when God walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day through Eden. And I think every time that we interact with nature, a hint of Eden whispers to us. And it reminds us that earth is not our permanent home, and God has something infinitely more beautiful waiting for us when Jesus sets up the new heaven and the new earth in the future. And Jesus based many of his parables on seeds and planting and harvesting. And today I want to share with you the lessons I've learned from nearly 30 years of gardening myself. So my love of gardening began on visits to my great-grandparents' farm. I have a photographic memory, so I can remember back as far as the blizzard of 1979. That's my first memory. I was only 16 months old. So, yeah, a strong memory runs in my family, and I think my great-grandma was the first person to have it. And she was a farm wife. She was a mother of 6, and she never ran out of things to do, as you can imagine. I think she was in her 60s before she even got a washing machine, you know, so even as busy as she was, she always made time for beautiful things. So I can remember her flowers. I remember her red tulips that bloomed by the back door, her lilac bush that smelled so good in the springtime. She had purple cone flowers in her flower beds, and they always had butterflies on them. And she had sweet peas that were growing up around the pole. It was like the dinner bell that she would ring to bring the guys in to eat lunch. And she had these bushy plants that were called 4 o'clocks. I don't know if you've heard of these, but at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, their flowers open up. And I remember going over there and thinking that was pretty magical when I was 3 years old. And then she had a clothesline, which is where she hung all her clothes to dry. And at either end of it, she had a tire that she made into a little miniature flower bed, and she put dianthus in there, and they smell like cloves. They're kind of related to carnations. So the lesson I learned, I'm going to share about 20 lessons with you in little vignettes, that beauty matters. We have a craving for beauty that God has put in all of our hearts, and we're all enjoying these beautiful decorations here. And Ecclesiastes 3:11 tells us, he has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Whether you place a fresh flower on your table or desk, or visit another's garden and enjoy it, you can use that time to praise God for the beauty that only he can create. And I still marvel that he can use dust and water to make the most beautiful creations. So my next memory of gardening was from my paternal grandparents' garden. After my parents divorced when I was 4, my mom, my sister, and I lived in their finished basement for a few years until Mom saved up enough money to have her own house. So in the summer, this is in the 1980s, they had just a huge vegetable garden. And they had tomato plants, corn, green beans, potatoes, and cantaloupe. And they also had several pecan trees bordering the garden. So I remember many evenings of sitting around the table after supper, watching Wheel of Fortune or The Golden Girls, while Grandma would just dump out green beans on the table, and we'd snap the ends off, And in the winter, we'd have the pecans, and she'd give us each a little picker, and we'd dig them all out, and which is great when your hands are this small, you're pretty good at it. But that was just a neat time of fellowship, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the project, and then knowing that all winter long we're storing up this food that we're going to enjoy. So the lesson I learned from their garden is that hard work pays off. The Bible tells us in Galatians 6:9, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Hard work is easier and more enjoyable when you have others to help you as well. When I was 13 years old, my dad let me have a flower bed just for me. He built a wooden frame and placed it at the edge of the property in the full sun. And since I didn't live with him, I just visited when I could. I needed to choose plants that didn't need a lot of attention, plants that would thrive without a lot of water. And the flower bed was not near where the hose was, and I didn't want to spend my entire visit toting buckets of water over there. So I picked plants like blanket flower, cosmos, and moss rose. And then I put a heavy layer of mulch that kept whatever moisture they had would keep it in. And every time I visited, I was so proud to see those flowers. And the lesson I learned from my first garden is that choices matter. Had I chosen high maintenance plants, my garden would have failed. But since I chose well, I reaped the benefits from it. Proverbs 9:12 states, "If you are wise, your wisdom will reward you." When we make wise choices, we can experience greater joy. So when I was a newlywed, my husband and I had an apartment on the second floor of a building, and it had a little deck. And I was eager to have a container garden, so just containers instead of an actual garden. So he got me some cinder blocks and some treated boards, and I just made 2 shelves of flowers, and I just direct sowed the seed right in the dirt. So by midsummer, I had phlox, marigolds, alyssum, and petunias. And it wasn't fancy, but it made me feel like I had my own garden. A few years later, we built our own house in the middle of the woods, which we had to clear ourselves. And when we moved in, our oldest son was 3 months old, and we had no more money to spend on landscaping. And so I have a picture. I didn't bring it because it's a little embarrassing, but I spread a big old tarp out over basically the woods and put my containers from the back deck of my apartment, because I was bound and determined to have a pseudo garden that year, and it was going to take several more years until I had the money to landscape really the way that I wanted to, or the time. You just can't do a lot of gardening with a newborn baby. You just can't do it. So the lesson I learned from my container garden is to be content with what you have. Though I long to have the big, beautiful flower beds, I chose to appreciate those little pots of flowers that decorated my deck and later substituted for my flower beds. Philippians 4:12 through 13 says, "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or want. I can do all through him who gives me strength. So, in addition to flower beds, I wanted a big vegetable garden. But because I knew the work that it entailed, I couldn't take it on in the years I was having my babies. My grandparents at that time lived right up the road from me, about a mile, so I worked out a compromise, which they were more than happy to do. I said, how about you babysit your great-grandchild while I go outside and water your garden if you'll give me like 2 or 3 rows? And they're like, yes, we'll do it. And so I planted 1 row of sunflowers. Those are my favorite, and if you follow me, they're on my logo and everything I do. A row of zinnias and a few, I think 3 baby pumpkin, you know those little pumpkins are about this big? So I wish I had a picture of this, but we had enough baby pumpkins that year, they covered one of these round tables. I mean, it was 60 or 70. And I mean, I made as much pumpkin pie as I could, but you know, it takes a lot of work to carve out a little pumpkin like this. So I gave a lot of it away. And my friends and family knew I was trying to establish my gardens, and so they began sharing plants with me. I received hostas and irises from my grandparents, chrysanthemums and roses from my mom, azaleas from my sister, and lilies and columbines from my dad. Those plants slowly filled the gaps in my beds and reminded me of the people I love. The lesson I learned from that season is to be patient. I knew it would take time before I could afford the flower beds I really wanted. But if I added to them little by little, I would have them in years to come. And my garden would be more special because of the plants I added in from other people. Romans 8:25 says, "But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. Waiting patiently without grumbling shows that we trust God." So finally, I talked my husband, who's a big, strong guy, into clearing off the sunniest space near the house and building a vegetable garden for me. He had to use heavy equipment. He's a general contractor, so he has that available, to move the dirt and then build a retaining wall. And after that, he just tilled a few bags of compost into the existing soil. Well, the soil that we have where I am is really heavy clay. It's great for making pots, not so great for growing plants. So you have to do a lot of soil amendment to make it loose enough for the roots to grow. So I didn't have a very successful first year. I had to spend a lot more money on bags of compost and peat moss to work into there. And then the other thing that happened is because this was native untouched soil that used to have trees on it and poison ivy and honeysuckle vines. So that's what I was pulling out from between my green beans and lettuces, you know. And if you've ever dealt with those kind of things, it's not like a dandelion that you just pull up by the root and it's done. It has this network system, and every piece of root that breaks off forms a new plant. I mean, it will give you a headache. So I just had to keep digging them up by hand, year after year after year, and finally they stopped overtaking my garden. The lesson I learned from that season is that soil quality matters. Jesus told a famous parable about soil quality in Matthew 13. He compared soil to our hearts. Good soil produces a good harvest, but soil that is hard, rocky, or choked with thorns or poison ivy will not present the best growing environment. Our hearts are the same way. If you allow God to soften and nourish your heart while cleaning out the rocks and thorns, He can reap a rich harvest through you. So a couple years after using this till method that many people still use, I went to a gardening seminar at the Nature Center in Cape, and one of the presenters told us about a lasagna garden. Have you ever heard of this? So what you do is you start with a base layer of like cardboard, which is like the weed blocker. And then you layer on organic material like shredded paper, compost, peat moss, and scraps from your vegetables in your kitchen. And as you do that, you make this raised bed so that your plants are growing in that instead of your not very good soil that you have. So it's an easier way and a cleaner way to grow things than trying for years and years to improve your own soil. But before I could tackle such a task in my existing garden, I had to remove or relocate all the existing plants. The problem was, the first year I had the tilled garden, I planted a row of 16 strawberry plants. Well, what strawberry plants do is they send out runners, kind of like a spider web. And every runner, when it touches the ground, it makes a new plant. So the original plant only bears fruit the first year, and then it dies out, and then the runner plants. So if you're going to be a successful strawberry farmer, you constantly have to be replacing and moving your plants around, so only the first year plants are the ones that are there. Well, my 16 strawberry plants in about 3 years had turned into a 6 foot wide, 18 foot long strawberry field. So my son was about 5 years old at this time, and ever since he had started eating solid food, strawberries were his favorite. We would go out in about 4 weeks from late May to early June, that's strawberry season. We would pick about a quart every day, and I would have to watch him because he'd eat almost half of it before we get back to the house. So that was like the good part. But the bad part is they were taking over the whole universe of my garden. I mean, they were out of control. Plus, I am a keeper. I don't like to throw anything away. It drives my husband insane, okay? But I looked at these berries and I'm like, what am I going to do? I want my lasagna garden and I have to get them out of the way before I do this. But they're bearing gobs and gobs of berries. What am I going to do? So I read this quote in one of my gardening magazines that said, any plant is a weed if it's in the wrong place. Any plant. Even a good, healthy tomato plant is a weed in the wrong area. And I never thought about that. So what I did, and I tell this story in one of my books, I got my push mower out and I set it on the very lowest so it, shave the ground. And I got up the gumption and I ran over those strawberries and I was feeling so horrible. I just destroyed God's creation, But when I got done, this sense of relief flooded me. I thought, I got this out of the way so I can have the garden I want. So, of course, strawberries are pretty hardy. So even though I mowed them down, plenty of them survived. And I dug them up and I put them in their own little bed where they can't get out and destroy all the other plants. And they did just fine. So the lesson I learned from my strawberry plants was this: even good things in excess can become detrimental. Restoring balance brings peace. Because in the stage of life I'm in, very busy with my family, my work, my writing ministry, church activities, I must go to God on a regular basis to keep my priorities in check and cut out even the good things that are taking up too much space. And I love what Jesus tells us in Matthew 6:33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. And this verse always helps me bring everything back in line with the way it should be. Okay, so about 2012, I have some gardening picture books up here if you want to look at them after I'm done. About 2012, for Mother's Day, my husband built me my raised beds. I was so happy. So I took on a new challenge, which was raising seeds indoors. I had never done that before. And in fact, I'm kind of behind the game. It's February 3rd. I should have already got started on that. But maybe this week I'll figure out some time to do it. So I learned several lessons from that. And this is one of them I share in my book, Newness of Life. So you have to take lots of steps to get them to grow indoors. You have to start with the right soil, the right lighting conditions. You have to use fluorescent lighting for a certain amount of hours a day. You have to make sure they're wet enough but not too wet, and just all this tinkering with it. But it's just so joyful when you see all these little sprouts, you know. So once they get about an inch tall, what you have to do is brush them with your hand. And the reason that you do that every day for a couple weeks before you start setting them outside is because if you don't brush those stems, simply the wind on a day like today will make them flop over or break off, and they'll never grow right. They'll never grow straight and strong. So when you're brushing them, you're helping build that cell wall around the stems so they can be stronger. So the lesson that I learned from that is our trials do the same for us. They make us stronger. And I mean, I don't think anybody here enjoys going through trials. Am I right about that? Okay. I don't either. But I do know I can look backward and see how they did make me stronger. And I'm really better for them if I choose to see them in the right way. This year at Bible Study Fellowship, we're studying the book of Acts for the whole year. And one of the themes is how the early church faced persecution so often, but then they would turn to God in prayer, and then they would grow their numbers every time. And they'd get persecuted, join back together in prayer, and keep growing. And so God was using that in the early church, that pressure on them to make the gospel spread, just like Jesus said it was going to do. And so that's really what it's supposed to do in us as well. And in certain parts of the world, one of the ladies in my class is Chinese, and she's lived here for over 20 years, but she said that her family, her father just became a Christian, and his best friend was in prison for 20 years just for his Christian faith. So she said she personally knows people who suffer just for believing in Jesus there. And I just encourage you to remember the persecuted church around the world in your prayers as often as you can, because that's what they want from us more than anything. There's to support them in prayer. So Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 12:10, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And we can have that same attitude with God's help. Okay, so another lesson from growing seeds indoors. This shocked me. There are some seeds that actually grow better in total darkness. I love verbena plants. They're just pretty little flower clusters, and verbena seeds have to have complete darkness to sprout. So I read this on the back of the seed package. I'm like, whatever. So all these other ones are under my grow lights, and I put this one tray in my HVAC closet because I nobody's gonna go in there, nobody's gonna open it. And so 10 days later I open it, and lo and behold, it is covered in sprouts. I couldn't believe it, but it worked. So the lesson I learned from this is that we shouldn't despise our seasons of feeling like we're in darkness, because that's when God is still working. And even though we can't see it or feel it, God is always at work, even in those dark seasons. And I have experienced that in my own writing journey for a long time. I started blogging in 2010, so that's 10 years ago. And for the first, I don't know, 6, 7 years, nobody knew. It was my best friend and my mom reading it, you know what I mean? So, but now I'm a published author, and so that's what God reaped from that harvest. Psalm 33:18 gives me hope in this way. But the Lord watches over those who fear him, those who rely on his unfailing love. So he's watching over us even in those seasons of darkness. Another lesson that I learned from sowing seeds indoors is if you go to the Nature Center in Cape, they give you seed packets from the flowers that grow outside by the parking lots. Well, I was trying to grow those in my indoor things, and they would never even sprout at all, like a 0% success rate. And so I asked them about that, and they said, well, native plants, meaning ones that are native to Missouri, okay, have been here for thousands of years, what they actually do better is to be sown in the fall. And it's because they need the freeze-thaw cycle to go down deeper, deeper, deeper. Because what is characteristic of native plants, as of what you call cultivars, which mean they're just bred for annuals. They only last 1 year, and then they just die, and we're done with them. A native plant has longevity because if you buy, let's say, a marigold plant from Lowe's, this big, right? Its root system is only going to be about as tall as what the plant is, okay? So not very deep roots, right? But a native plant this big might have roots all the way down to the floor, or even taller than me. And the reason they have longevity is because their roots go all the way down to those underwater water sources, and they're able to withstand the drought or the floods that we have here because they're always tapped into that really deep, deep water source. I forgot to look up this verse, but I know there's a verse, I think it's in Psalm 1, and I know there's another one in Jeremiah that talks about the trees that are planted by the water, and it doesn't matter what season they're in, they bear fruit because their roots are in touch with the water. And we know that Jesus is our living water source. That's what he told the woman at the well. I am the living water that you can drink from and never perish. And that blew her mind. But that's what he meant. If we tap into that source, then we are not going to be beaten about by the whims of the weather or the whims of life storms. So I have a couple of lessons for you just that I've written about on my blog. So here's some excerpts. Here is a lesson on weeding. No matter how many weeds have overtaken a patch in my garden, I've learned to wait for the rain to come before I start weeding. And this is why. When the soil is dry, it's tight. And so if you try to pull a plant up, you might succeed a little bit, but then the leftover roots are in the soil. So when the rain comes, it loosens up the soil so that you can pull the whole plant up from the roots. So I also have learned in my heart, we talked about our hearts being like soil. It seems like weeding is easier after rain also. Sometimes it's the rain of life storms like sickness or meanness from other people. I didn't ask for it, but the storm came anyway. Sometimes it's from my own sin, like the sin of self-pity or self-righteousness, And those trials soften my heart, and they allow God to get in there and teach me a lesson. And so sometimes when I'm out in the garden weeding, I think about that, and I think about how I shouldn't be afraid when the storms come, because that's probably when he's going to do his best weeding work in my life. and maybe in yours too. Here is a lesson on watering. So even though I use hoses, I use drip hoses to perfectly water all my beds, and I got all the fancy stuff now. Nothing does better than just a slow and steady rain. Some of you might experience this with your lawns. Maybe your husbands are just crazy about their lawns. My stepfather is. He has like radar for dandelions, and he wants this perfectly manicured, and he'll spray it. But I mean, there's just no, we've had week after week in August when we're just trying to water to keep it alive. And then God sends us one of those wonderful afternoon thunderstorms and it's like it comes, but with 10 brighter shades of green. And it's because God's rain goes everywhere, all the surrounding areas, so they can get all the rain from all, not just dripped in where we give it. In the same way, I feel like time with God gives me life like no other experience, even in comparison to time with my loved ones or my friends. I feel like when I get watered by my daily time with Jesus, I'm actually more able to enjoy my time with others because I feel like I'm filled up and ready to give to them. So I think it is very important to get in God's Word every day so that we can get nurtured that way. Here's a lesson on pruning. So one year my hydrangea bushes did not bloom very well. And so I consulted one of my gardening books for answers. And it turns out that I pruned them at the wrong time and I caused the problem. So pruning shrubs is actually an art. Some shrubs, like my spirea bush, bloom best when they are cut all the way to the ground in early spring. Almost like you can't see them. Other shrubs bloom on last year's wood. If they're trimmed too early, they won't bloom. That's what happened to my hydrangeas. I cut off all last year's wood, then I had no flowers. But other shrubs, like lilacs, bloom best if only part of the plant is pruned and the rest is left to grow. So you might prune a third of it one year, a third the next, and the other third the third year, and then the plant will be strong and healthy. So when I reflect on past seasons in my heart's garden, I can see correlations to the perfect timing of God's pruning shears. I remember times when I was pruned all the way to the ground. I'm sure that you all have some pretty hard situations where you felt like that too. At the time, it seemed intolerable and painful, but I can look back and see how it provided a new flush of growth in my faith life after those things happened. And other times, I had to wait for painful situations to run their course before God pruned them away. Like, for example, I had some work situations that were really hard, but I was under contract and I decided to just fulfill my contract. And even though it was hard to persist, I can be proud of myself that I did keep my word to keep those contracts. And then the pruning occurred and I could grow in a different direction. And then I remember a couple seasons where I bloomed best on last year's lessons. And this seemed to be true again. I've been in Bible study fellowship since like 2006. So every year we pick a different book of the Bible. I told you we're doing Acts this year, but we've done Matthew and Romans and John and Isaiah, Revelations. And it felt like when I spent a whole 9 months in those books, the lessons just kept carrying over into the next year. So only God understands the best pruning times for us in our heart's gardens. And we have to trust that his ways are higher than our ways and his pruning methods are better than ours. And we may not always understand his timing or his methods, but we can trust that He is wise, good, and holy, and He always wants the best for us. And He's pruning us so that we can bloom more beautifully and produce more fruit. So